All right, this final video on psycholinguistics or psychology of language is going to cover language in animals. So this is an area that kind of overlaps with comparative cognition, which is cognitive psychology that deals with kind of animals other than humans or comparing humans to other animals. So one question that comes up anytime we talk about like what is language, how does language work, how does it relate to all the other interesting cognitive things that humans can do. One question that always comes up is, well, what about animals? Are animals capable of language? Certainly animals have complex communication systems, but as we saw when we talked about definitions of language in the first psycholinguistics video, the idea of language is different than just being able to communicate information. So birds singing and whales singing their songs may get information across. It may even get useful information across. So for example, vervet monkeys out in the wild, they have different calls for different alarm calls for different predators. So if there's like a predator coming from the air, then they'll make a different call than if there's a ground predator, like a snake or a puma or something like that. So that gets interesting, useful information across. Different signals can cause different behaviors and conspecifics. That's important, but it's not necessarily the same thing as language in the sense of how we use it and how, children, when they're learning language, are starting to develop certain cognitive skills. That's not the same thing. So the question of language in animals, it's a complicated one, and it's one that we run into even kind of day to day right now. So for example, there's been an adorable dog named Stella that has gotten kind of Instagram famous in 2019 and 2020. If you're curious and want to see see Stella in action, I've got a link to her Instagram here. You can see little short clips of her using this little talking board so she can quote unquote speak. So basically she hits one of these buttons with her paws, and whatever the English label is here, basically the little speaker makes that sound in English. It says a word out loud when she hits it with her paw, allowing her to say things like outside if she wants to go outside, or happy if, supposedly if she's happy, and things like that. So she's able to communicate with her owner, or at the very least, like make connections between when I press this button, food shows up. When I press this other button, water shows up. When I press this other button, my toy shows up, and so on. So if you're curious, you can watch this CNN interview with the speech language pathologist who is Stella's owner, who trained her to do this. And it is really neat. It's neat what Stella can do. It's a neat trick. It's a neat interspecies communication. But whether it's language, I think, is a much more important question for us as cognitive psychologists, because just because the speech language pathologist who trains Stella, just because she calls it language or talks about it as if it's language, doesn't mean that it is. So we need to think about what it would mean to verify, or what it would mean to test whether an animal is actually using language. And by the way, this Instagram famous dog that's gone viral recently is not a new thing. Even like 12 or 13 years ago, there was someone who had done the same thing with a dog in, I believe it was Portugal. In Brazil. So they taught their dog, it's Portuguese coming out of the soundboard here, but they taught the dog basically to press a certain button to make it say agua for water, or for, toy or outside, or so on. So it said agua when it hits the button and gets its water. And I'll show you a couple more examples here. Here they put the toy out of reach, so the dog wants to request the toy. It has the ability to do that. So certainly someone like B.F. Skinner would watch this and say, okay, that's cool, but that's just the dog doing a trick. That's operant conditioning and classical conditioning. It has learned certain associations between its behavior and the outcomes that happen. When it presses one button, water shows up. When it presses another button, it goes outside. When it presses another button, it gets its toy, and it's just picking up on those patterns in the world. That doesn't mean that it's speaking the language, in this case Portuguese, or that Stella is speaking English or using English as a language, right? That's not the same thing. Now, there are interesting questions here about communication that might still be cognitive questions. So, for example, you'll see here the dog looking back and forth to the owner, sort of what's called joint attention or gaze alternation, like trying to share attention with the owner to look, what is the owner paying attention to? Is the signal getting across? So that's one of those aspects of language I talked about in the first video. That's pragmatics. The pragmatics of language is about things like turn taking or sharing attention, right? So the social elements of language that may not be about understanding syntax or semantics, but are at that intersection of just pure communication and social cognition. So here's an example of that. So in the last clip, in this one, you saw examples of the dog kind of looking to the owner and back and forth. So it's not just pressing the button and then something shows up in the environment. It understands that the button leads to some behavior by the owner. Now, whether that means that it understands it's communicating to the owner versus just picking up on the pattern that when it does that behavior, the owner does something, right? Something happens in the environment. That's a very different question. That's a theory of mind kind of question that's a little deeper, but seems to be fundamental to whether an animal is using language when they're doing something like that. So actually, a lot of the real scientific work on animal language has come from not dogs, but from our close cousins, our primates, primate cousins like chimpanzees especially, but also gorillas, and there have been quote-unquote language-trained orangutans as well. So great apes are kind of closest to us evolutionarily speaking, closest to us in terms of brain structure, a lot of their other cognitive capacities when we test them in things like problem solving and memory and things like that. They're often, in line with a young human, with children of various ages, depending on the cognitive skill we're talking about. So there was, for a long time, people thought maybe these animals are capable of language. They're capable of doing the same things we are, but they just can't get the language out. So the hypothesis for a long time was maybe great apes can use language. They're capable of it in their brains at the cognitive level. They just don't have the vocal cords for it. And that's true, actually. So gorillas and chimpanzees, for example, they can't do the same things with their vocal apparatus that we can. Their articulators can't articulate the same way we can. So it makes sense that they can't speak English, even though people tried for years. They've certainly trained primates to make noises that sound a little bit like certain words with their mouth, but the animals are just learning to make those noises, and they're not very similar to English or to whatever language they're being taught. So in that sense, like vocalizing didn't seem a good way, speech didn't seem a good way to teach these animals language. So someone had the clever idea, what about using sign language? And so some early work in the 60s and 70s tried to train initially chimpanzees and like I said, later gorillas and orangutans, but tried to train chimpanzees to use sign language. So sort of a modified version of American Sign Language, a modified version of ASL, kind of simplified, but allowing them to use a lot of the same, like they can form things with their hands more closely to the way a human does signs than they can speak, similar to the way humans speak. So the gardeners were a couple of researchers in Nevada who originally tried this. They actually had the idea of trying to give a chimpanzee the best opportunity to learn language, if such as possible. And so what they did is raise the chimpanzee around humans and sort of getting immersed in language as a communication and everyday social skill thing from the very start. So they used sign language and sort of verbalized as they did it for everything, and kind of deliberately trained. The first chimp was called Washoe, so they deliberately trained Washoe from a very young age, and they had some pretty impressive results. I've actually got their original book. They didn't ever publish in peer-reviewed journals, unfortunately, but they did publish their work in a book called Teaching Sign Language to the Chimpanzee, and it led to a bunch of other researchers following suit and training other chimpanzees. So I'm going to show you this video real quick, introducing you to Washoe and their research, and then we'll talk about some more details here and how we test this stuff scientifically.
Most famous and controversial attempts began in Nevada.
On June 21st, 1966, an infant chimpanzee arrived in our laboratory. We named her Washoe for Washoe County, the home of the University of Nevada. Because she was captured wild in Africa, we will never know just where or when Washoe was born, but we estimate that she was about 10 months old when she arrived in Reno.
Because chimps' vocal apparatus doesn't allow them to make the sounds of human speech, psychologists Alan and Trixie Gardner decided to teach Washoe sign language, used by the deaf. To help Washoe learn her signs, they used many techniques, including fun and familiar games repeated over and over again.
The first sign that we did indeed teach to Washoe was the sign for more. 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 More.
Natural chimpanzee gestures provided the basis for some signs.
Come. Open. Open, hurry. Open. Open, hurry. Open, hurry. Open. Open. Open.
Where is the play baby? Where?
As she grew up, Washoe's vocabulary gently expanded. For the first time, an ape was shown to use a human language.
Smart, Washoe.
Good, 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 me. Yes, you're very good. Good, go. Good, go. Where? You. Peekaboo. Out, me. Oh, play hide. Peekaboo. Okay. Come, good Washoe. Come with me.
The Gardners reported that Washoe could eventually use 133 signs.
Good Wash and I are going to go.
By then, Washoe was 5 years old.
Good me.
The Gardners expanded their laboratory by moving to a ranch outside Reno. After Washoe, their findings were repeated with 4 other chimpanzees, all raised like children from birth, and with personalities just as individual.
This is the living quarters of chimpanzee Tatu. And they are all special, but she was quite special in what a neat chimpanzee she was. For her, we could keep all sorts of things out here just as you see them now, and Tatu would leave them as they were. She would hop in a very chimp-like fashion all over this cabin. She was not content to stay on the floor, but she left these objects as they should be. Tatu, unlike our others, had black as her very favorite color. We would go through magazines looking for black things, and she would go around naming black things for you. That's black, and that's black, and that is black. And sometimes you could even tease her about that. You'd go through a magazine and she'd point at it and at a picture and give you eye-to-eye contact, a question, what is that? And for a while you played her game and you said, it's black, using her favorite sign. But then you tease her and say it was red, and of course she would correct you right away and say, it's black, that's black. It's a very nice conversational use of sign language. She knew the answer, but she wanted you to talk about that.
What we're interested in is not whether it fitted some abstract theory of linguistics, but whether the chimpanzees could actually communicate information to us, things we didn't already know. We had many informal observations of this. For instance, The chimpanzee was up high in the tree, could see over the house and see who was arriving. And you could ask Washoe, who's coming? And she could tell us something we didn't know.
So I think this is a good example, what Alan Gardner is saying at the end there. There's a good example of how that conversation about the scientific research into language in animals has gone. A lot of researchers have given up on the idea that animals show or can fully learn kind of language to the level that humans have for all the natural human languages. Like, we talked about the different properties of natural human languages that exist across, all languages that we've known so far. We talked about that in the first set of language slides, and honestly, like that, it's just a criteria that other animals other than humans have not been able to meet all at once anyway, right? That we can see certain elements in one animal, certain elements in another animal, but never all together in a single package as a whole communication system that might be called a language in that formal sense. And so a lot of researchers have become more interested in the idea of, well, okay, maybe it's not language per se, but maybe it's a complex communication system that can be used, that can do interesting things, even if it's never going to be to the same extent as what we think of as language that, linguists are interested in studying for humans. So I thought he made a good point there at the end, which is maybe we just need to revise what we're talking about. Maybe this is just a problem of what we mean by language and people talking at two very different levels for that. So it's still very interesting what animals are able to do using these communication systems, including ones adapted from human languages like ASL or spoken English. That said, it's really easy to take this stuff too far and start assuming that these animals have a capacity with language that's the same as ours just because they're using some behaviors or signs or sounds that look and sound kind of like our language. So I'm going to give you an example of this that I think is actually really misleading. I want you to watch this video with a skeptical eye. So this is a video, I think it's like a public service announcement for, climate change or something like that, or conservation. But this is Koko the gorilla, so one of the most famous and well-known great apes who was taught sign language, in this case by Penny Patterson. She's not an academic, she's not a researcher, so she worked with this great ape, this gorilla for decades. She's worked with him, and yet she hasn't published peer-reviewed articles. She hasn't actually subjected his signs to science to test whether it fits language in some, more formal classification system. It's really neat what Koko can do, and I think watching the videos of Koko, it can remind you how closely related we are to these animals and how much capacity they have for intelligence, for empathy, for a lot of things, right? Koko has had cats, sort of adopted cats along the way, and treated them really gently and seemed to really love them, and it's really neat to watch. But I want you to watch this public service announcement, this video of Koko using signs and the translations that some humans have added along the bottom for the behaviors that Koko's doing, and I want you to think about whether you think Koko is actually saying those things that are coming up in the humans' captions, or whether you think there might be something else going on here. So let's watch this. So that it comes across as a really powerful message if you're not looking at it skeptically, right? If you're seeing that as if Koko is using this language and understands those words in the same way we do, right? As if Koko is saying, I love mankind. That's a big thing to say, a big abstract thing to say, right? That's not just like simple nouns you can point to. To love mankind, to love a species is a big abstract understanding of something. Or the metaphorical use of language, like I am flowers, I am nature. That seems really cool. But if you've taken any ASL classes yourself, you probably watching her would be like, yeah, that's not really like distinct ASL signs in a clear way that like someone who had no other, no captions at the bottom would have come up with the exact same translation there. In fact, it's quite a bit of a stretch a lot of the time. So instead, what may be happening here is an interpretation of these signs that's kind of biased by the people who are doing the captioning, or by Penny Patterson, whoever's creating the video, and that may be misrepresenting or over-representing the extent to which Koko actually understands what she's doing when she makes these hand movements, and also the extent to which she has the same understanding of the signs. So even if she makes the correct sign with her hands or very close to it, that doesn't necessarily mean she has the same understanding. And also, we have no idea for this video whether someone is sitting off the edge of the screen coaching her, like doing the signs, and she's just copying them and has no idea what they mean. She probably, I'm going to be honest, probably has no idea what the frickin' Paris Agreement is, what it's about, or like a message for humans watching TV. I don't think that's the case at all. So it may be that they coached her, or maybe they just did some editing and they just kept the ones that were close enough to some words that related to earth and nature and things like that. But this is the kind of thing where if we're not skeptical, it can seem like animals have this grasp of language. It's very similar to us, but that comes from not really testing scientifically whether these things are the case. So to help you understand why I'm so skeptical of Koko here, I want to give you another example. This is from sort of PR stunt that Penny Patterson, her owner and trainer, did a long time ago. So they were doing sort of live chatting on the internet, where Koko was answering questions that people on the internet were sending in. So for example, there was a question, what are the names of your kittens and dogs? Because Koko had, like I said, she had adopted kittens. One was named All Ball, for example, is a famous one. So she had sort of had some kittens that she hung out with and some dogs that she played with. So someone asked the names of the kittens, and Koko says, Foot. And again, she made a sign that Patterson is translating as foot. And then Patterson out loud has to explain, Foot isn't the name of your kitty. And then another question, Koko, what's the name of your cat? And Koko says, no. And then Penny Patterson says, she just gave some vocalizations there, some soft puffing. Okay, that's not very convincing that she understands the language here, right? I heard that soft puffing, says the chat host. And then Patterson now shaking her head, no. And then the question, do you like to chat with other people? And Koko says, fine nipple. And then Patterson tries to explain this away. Patterson says, oh, well, nipple rhymes with people. And she doesn't sign people per se. So she was trying to do a sounds like kind of thing. And holy crap, that's a stretch, right? Yes, maybe that could explain why Koko signed fine nipple there, or it could be that she didn't actually understand the sentence and she was just signing some random things. So I actually think Koko and her owner, Penny Patterson, are not a good example of language research in apes. They have basically no data published, no controlled studies, no real evidence of anything other than Penny selectively interpreting hand motions and sort of prompting Koko to sign the desired words. Now, that doesn't mean that ape language research hasn't been done, that good research hasn't been done. I just don't think Koko, even though she's the most famous ape that signs, I don't think she's the best example. If you want a better example, there's actually a chimpanzee. So he's a pygmy chimpanzee, so a bonobo. It's sort of a slightly different species of chimpanzee, but a pygmy chimpanzee named Kanzi is actually most famous in the scientific literature because Kanzi didn't actually get trained on language directly initially. He was just a little baby bonobo following around his mom, and the mom was being trained. And in this case, she wasn't being trained on sign language. She was being trained on something called a lexigram board. So lexigrams, what that means is like a board of just arbitrary symbols that aren't shaped like the things that they represent. So, for example, there might be a random symbol for tree, but it didn't look like a tree, right? Or a random symbol for water, but it doesn't look like water. A random symbol for peanut, but it doesn't look like a peanut. So these arbitrary mappings, just like we have with the letters and words in English not looking or sounding like the things they represent. But in this case, rather than English or some existing language, they just create these arbitrary symbols and map them out to certain spoken words and the reference, the objects that go with them. So Kanzi's mom was being trained on this lexigram board, and Kanzi, as this little baby bonobo, was just kind of hanging around, like standing on his mom's shoulder, crawling around. But what they found is when his mom was away from the board, without Kanzi ever having been rewarded, ever getting reinforcement for learning these different behaviors, Kanzi seems to have observationally just picked up language from seeing his mom interact with the researchers and his mom get rewarded. And so in this observational learning, Kanzi started to use the lexigram board in a way that showed he had at the very least picked up what each of those lexigrams stood for or referred to, in the sense of an association between a given, picture on the board, the sounds that come out, and the object it refers to. So he was able to use the lexigram board without being explicitly reinforced, which is a little bit impressive if you come at this from a skeptical sort of B.F. Skinner operant conditioning perspective. Usually we think of operant conditioning being the way of learning these fancy tricks where you have to get rewarded along the way to learn that stuff. But this is another example of other types of learning, like observational learning, where we can pick up on information without explicit reinforcement. Now, it still doesn't mean it's language, but I think this is a better example. There's a lot of work that's been published on Kanzi using controlled laboratory studies to try and rule out alternative explanations. So I'm going to show you an example of Kanzi using a lexigram board. Now, this is Kanzi as an adult. Much later, you'll see as a bonobo even, they're smaller than other chimpanzees, but Kanzi is a little overweight here, probably from all the treats. But you'll see Kanzi using this lexigram board, and it actually has pages and pages of lexigrams. So he's learned this giant vocabulary of words that he can use to at least refer to different things.
Banana.
Banana.
Very nice.
Banana. Banana.
Can you find peanuts?
Peanut.
Thank you. Will you find eggs?
Sherman. Egg.
Good. Can you find milk? Milk.
Milk.
Sherman is the name of another language trained, in this case chimpanzee, from the same facility, the Language Research Institute in Atlanta. I actually met and worked with and have published some studies on the chimpanzees there that use these lexigram boards. I haven't met Kanzi. I did meet Washoe and did some signing with the other chimps in Washoe's family, so Dar and Tatu and them, back before they left Central Washington University. So these are all, most of these animals we're seeing are still alive. Some of the chimps at Central Washington have passed on, and Washoe's been dead for a while now. But yeah, Kanzi, you can see here using this lexigram board, what we're getting is basically a really, really fancy memory trick. So this isn't yet anything more fancy than what the dog is able to do, right? But of course, we can do tests to see whether they use the appropriate symbol to, for example, request the food they want or communicate something interesting. So let's watch a few more examples of this just to show the extent of the vocabulary itself, the memory trick itself. Oops, crap. Sorry.
Banana.
Okay.
Sue.
Sue.
Very good. Can you find peanuts?
Peanut.
Very nice.
Peanut.
How about eggs? Egg. Just go ahead and hit it.
Good.
Very good.
Good.
Sure, good boy. How about, let's see, strawberries. Can you find strawberries?
Strawberries.
Very nice. Bunny. Can you find bunny?
Bunny.
Good. How about water? Can you find water?
Water.
So you can see he has, I messed up again. You can see he has like 5 pages of lexigrams, and there's a big pile of them on each page. So that's a lot that he's able to use. He certainly can associate the sounds when she says a word with him pressing him. We need more controlled studies, like I said, to figure out whether he understands what those refer to. And they've done those and shown that at the very least, there's no problem with a chimpanzee figuring out what each of those sounds or lexigrams refers to in terms of picking out an actual banana for the sound or the lexigram banana, matching the lexigram especially to specific nouns, people, places, things, food, stuff like that. That's no problem at all. But of course, dogs can do that, pigeons can do that, rats can do that. So that's not language in and of itself, right? What's maybe more interesting with these lexigram boards is there was some research back when I was in graduate school. I did some research with these chimpanzees, and one of the things we did is I had taught some capuchin monkeys to use a laser pointer. They actually used a joystick to control the laser pointer to point to things, to sort of make choices, what food they wanted when it's far away, things like that. We also did that with the chimpanzees at the Language Research Center, and so they controlled a laser pointer. And one of the tests that Charlie Menzel, one of the researchers there, did is he had the chimpanzees, after they learned to use this laser pointer that they controlled with a joystick, he had the chimpanzees go through this experiment where one of the researchers who had worked with the chimps before would come in view of the chimps, so they had sort of an indoor and outdoor access, and basically were surrounded by a big forest, so their outdoor access was still enclosed by some fencing. They couldn't get to the other side of the fencing out into the open forest on one side. And so we had a researcher come in and show the chimps like some M&Ms, something they really liked. And they'd take the M&Ms and they'd put it in some Tupperware, close the Tupperware up, show it, make sure the chimps were watching. And then they would bury it in the ground out in the forest on the other side of the fence where the chimps couldn't get to it. And they would bury it somewhere out in this giant forest, right? But in sight of the chimps where they could see it through the fence. And then that researcher would leave for the day. And then another researcher would come in the next morning, and that other researcher didn't even know if this was one of the days when they were doing a trial. They just did this randomly throughout the year, but every once in a while they would do this. And that researcher was never told that this was a morning when there might have been something hidden or what would have been hidden, right? But then what they observed was the chimpanzees would go and first get the attention of the second researcher when they came in the next morning. They would get the person's attention using the lexigram board. They would press the person's name and be like, come over here, come over here. And then they would, once the person came over, they would say, outside. And then they'd press the food that was buried, like M&Ms. They'd say like, outside M&Ms, outside M&Ms. And they would go run to their outdoor part of their enclosure, and the experimenter would go outside of the fence. And then the chimpanzee got out the laser pointer and moved it out to where the food was buried out in the woods, where the other experimenter had no idea that there was anything or what was out there, and they were consistently able to pick the correct food and to point to where it had been hidden a whole day before, and to communicate that information using the lexigram board and the laser pointer to point where, to communicate that information, even, information from a whole day ago. So that's pretty impressive in terms of what you're able to do with language, right? On the pragmatic side of language, that is some impressive communication of information that fits a lot of the roles of what we use language for, and that's why I think this stuff is so cool. I still don't think it would meet most linguists' definition of sort of the language in the sense of a natural human language, but it's starting to get closer. Now, as I said, we need to be careful to do things in this controlled manner, laboratory studies where we can make sure to rule out alternative explanations or priming by the human. So I'm going to show you an example, even back from the early studies done by the gardeners, that shows how much better we can do this research, like even back in the 60s, than the bullshit that Penny Patterson and others like her have been peddling for a long time. So here's the chimpanzees I talked about before, Washoe and them, that the gardeners raised. So this is going to be one of the other chimps raised with Washoe, I think Dar. And you're going to see them getting tested in controlled circumstances that are double blind. So basically there's an experimenter watching the signs of the chimpanzee as it looks at pictures, a sort of slideshow of pictures. The chimpanzee can see the slide and can then do the sign for what that word is. But then the experimenter who's trying to decide, like, did they do the right sign or not, has no idea what slide the chimp is looking at. They just have to look at the sign the chimp makes and see if they can deduce what word the chimp is saying, and then later someone else can grade those responses and see if they match up with the slide that was there. So here's an example of a sort of early version of a controlled study where we try and rule out some of that bias that might be coming, sort of priming that might be coming from the trainers or the researchers.
normal observations could not constitute scientific proof, so the gardeners tested their chimp's vocabulary under controlled double-blind conditions. 2 independent observers had to agree for a sign to be marked correct. Dar could see the image on the screen, but Alan Gardner could not. This excluded the possibility that the chimp was picking up inadvertent clues to the right answer. Smart. Dar was the last chimp to join the project. By the age of 5, he had a vocabulary of 122 signs. In the wild, a chimp of Dar's age is only just weaned and won't reach adulthood for another 10 years.
So that's just an example of some of the clever techniques we can use in research to try and rule out those alternatives and see, like, are these animals able to do more than you know, the screwy stuff that some trainer had Koko do that may have just been sort of a gimmick, right? But the question is still, is that really language, though? And B.F. Skinner, of course, right, so that the neo-Skinnerians, the neo-behaviorists would argue that maybe they've just learned a trick by being reinforced in the past. So what we really maybe want, if we're talking about language, is a test not just for you know, whether or not they've got vocabulary, or whether or not they can make an association between a symbol or a sound and some object out in the world. That's what Stella the dog is doing on Instagram. That's what you know, anyone's dog can do, but that's what a pigeon can do. That's what any animal can do if it can learn anything, right? If it can do operant and classical conditioning, then it can do that. But that's not language. So one of the big elements that makes language is syntax, right? The fact that it's rule-based and has to follow certain rules that allow us to do so much with language. So can we put the pieces together in the right order, in the right ways, following these rules? And especially if we can find that in novel circumstances. So not just using 4 words in a row as if that's kind of a quote-unquote sentence, as you might see Stella the dog using a sentence of a few words put together, but they're words that she might have, you know, done that combination before and been rewarded for it. Instead, what we want to look for is novel circumstances where they can't have been trained or reinforced for that in the past, but are still showing an understanding and use, a production of language using syntax, right? Not just associations of words to objects. And while we do that, we have to avoid what's called the clever Hans effect. So what is the clever Hans effect? Well, this horse that you're seeing the pictures of, this is clever Hans the horse, who was famous a long time ago, over 100 years ago now, for doing math. So clever Hans, it was a horse that could solve math problems. They would do things in front of big crowds where the owner of the horse would say, like, you know, Hans, what is 2 + 4? And Hans would stamp his foot. He would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then he would stop stamping his foot. And it was 2 + 4. That's 6. Amazing. Everyone would clap and get excited. And then his owner would say, Hans, what is 3 × 3? And Hans would go stamp, 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 stamp. And after 9, he would stop, and everyone would go, oh my God, that's amazing. He knows that 3 × 3 is 9. And they could do all these math problems in front of crowds, and Hans got it right most of the time. And everyone was really impressed. And of course, you might be saying, like, oh, maybe there's a trick to this, right? Maybe the owner was just like tricking people to make money. We actually have reason to think, historians of psychology have looked into this quite a bit. It turns out his owner really didn't seem to be purposely tricking anyone. He had no idea what was going on. He actually thought his horse understood math. That's why he was bringing it around to show off, and it became such a big thing. He truly did believe his horse understood math, just like a lot of people truly think that their dog understands language or whatever. But it turns out what Hans was doing was not math. Hans didn't understand math at all. Instead, Hans, the horse, had a very keen eye for watching the reactions of the humans around him, his owner, but also the people in the crowd. And so what would happen is, if he was asked, Hans, what is 3 × 3? And he would just start his stamping, right? He would just start hitting his foot, but without any understanding of how far he was going, any understanding of what number of stamps he should do. He wasn't keeping track of that. He would just keep stamping until he got an imperceptible to us but an imperceptible little reaction from the people in the crowd or the owner, right? So if the owner is sitting there watching and counting 7, 8, and then he hits the right answer of 9, there's probably just a little bit of an exhalation of breath, a little bit of a relaxing in the posture of the humans who are watching. And that was enough for clever Hans the horse to know that he should stop stamping his foot, that he'd reached the correct answer. So that was actually how clever Hans was doing math, so to speak, right? But he wasn't actually doing math. And I think that's a good lesson for us when it comes to animal research and likewise to research on human babies and things like that. It's why we need these controlled laboratory tests and why we need things like the double-blind conditions that we saw earlier, where the humans can't necessarily see what the animal is seeing. So I'm going to show you another example in a moment here of it's a video of Kanzi being tested for syntax, for understanding of the ordering of words, not just the correct that this word means this and this word means that, but to see whether he understands the ordering of words, even for brand new novel combinations. So think back when we talked about language and the understanding, for people who don't have Broca's aphasia, they're able to understand things like the boy pushed the girl is different than the girl pushed the boy, right? So we can understand girl and we can understand boy, but we really have to understand syntax in order to understand which of them is doing the verb to the other one, right? Which is the victim and which is the instigator. That is fundamentally a big part of any language at all. So that's what we want to test if we really are trying to argue that these animals are capable at a cognitive level of doing language or using language. So you're going to see a video in a second here of Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, one of the researchers who worked with Kanzi early on. Sue Savage-Rumbaugh is going to be, one, wearing a mask over her face, in this case like a welder's mask, so that Kanzi can't look at where her eyes are going and can't use any cues from her for where he should, what object he should be grabbing and doing things with. So to avoid that feedback, to avoid the clever Hans effect, she'll be wearing a mask. And you'll see her giving him commands that he's never heard before. So telling him to put things together or do things in a way that he's never done before. So like put the pine needles on the basketball or, put the television outside or something like that. So let's watch an example of some of this testing. And this is quite a while ago, but one of the things Kanzi got famous for.
Kanzi, could you cut the onions with your knife? Well, that's very good. Thank you. Kanzi, are you listening? Could you put some soap in the water? Good job. Thank you. Thank you. Could you listen again?
So there are a bunch more examples like this, but again, they tested things on purpose that he had never done before, and they tried it randomizing the order of things so that they could tell whether he was getting whether he was using the syntax, putting the right thing on the right thing. So he made very few mistakes of taking the two nouns that were in the sentence and putting the wrong one in the wrong one, or using getting the syntax wrong. So it's actually this kind of thing was some of the early evidence that at least for our close primate relatives, they may be capable of some level of understanding syntax. So I don't want to go too much deeper into language and animals. If you're interested in this stuff, I can point you to books or articles, but I'll just kind of summarize basically where ape language research got to before it kind of fell off and stopped being as heavily researched. Basically, there's some limited evidence that other species can at least comprehend simple human language, that they can comprehend things even at the level of syntax. But again, this is limited evidence and only for simple syntax, simple grammar, simple language use. Production is much more limited and even more simple, and there's quite a bit of controversy in terms of whether they, any animals can really use much syntax when producing language. So yes, they may put multiple words together and those words may kind of be appropriate to the circumstances, but they're not necessarily putting them together, right? It's like telegraphed human speech where little toddlers will put 3 words together, but they're not necessarily making a sentence in terms of needing to have the correct order. So right, it's like Dog walk can mean I want to walk the dog, or there's a dog walking outside, or a variety of things. That doesn't tell us whether they understand at the level of syntax, right? So the evidence for production of language is much more limited for animals, at least when it comes to kind of full-blown language. But some would argue that there's at least some evidence there that they can, maybe at the simplest levels of language, comprehend and maybe even produce some language. Whether you want to call what animals do language, right? I think we can all at least agree non-human animals definitely don't use language as extensively as we do or with as much complexity as we do, but they certainly are able to communicate in interesting, complicated ways that involve a lot of other interesting cognitive variables that may be impressive, sometimes even more impressive than us, just like, for short-term memory and sensory memory, chimpanzees have slightly better memory than us. So this isn't sort of a dig at animals. It's just a question of like, what do we mean by language? And just based on the way linguists have defined it, it's easy to find people making overblown claims about their pets or a dog they see on Instagram. And I think we can have a little more skepticism and look at the published data and see that it's a more nuanced, complicated question. So if I was to ask you about this on the exam, I would not be asking you in a yes or no way, do animals have language? I don't think that's a fair question. I think it depends on what you mean by language, and it's a more nuanced question. So maybe this one would be a good short answer, for example, if it showed up on the exam, is what you think, based on the evidence, or what kind of evidence would convince you that animals have language and allow you to kind of apply what we've talked about in language or what we've talked about with animals. Just a side note, if you're curious, there's a researcher named Herb Terrace who actually trained a chimpanzee from a very young age, kind of raised like a kid, raised around other kids, and trained a chimpanzee to use language. He actually named the chimpanzee Nim Chimpsky, which sounds a lot like Noam Chomsky, who you'll remember is the language researcher who kind of shot down B.F. Skinner, who really put a nail in the coffin of the popularity of behaviorism a long time ago and started part of the cognitive revolution. Noam Chomsky has argued that we kind of have an innate language module as humans, that our brains come predisposed to understanding grammar, what he calls universal grammar. And so at the time, Herb Terrace was this researcher who wanted to kind of undermine Noam Chomsky, and so he named his chimp Nim Chimpsky to kind of make fun of Noam Chomsky. And he was teaching this chimp sign language while raising it kind of as if it was a human child. And because his argument was basically like, yeah, I bet they are capable of language, they just need to use it in the same way that human children learn language, which is growing up with it, having everyday experience, just doing it like, I want to go outside, I want to play with this, just using language in a normal way, the way humans learn it slowly over time, rather than taking an adult chimp and trying to teach it to make some movements with its hand. So in this project, if you're curious, there's a documentary about it. It's called Project Nim. It's actually really tragic and powerful. At the end of the research, Herb Terrace ended up going back over his data when they went to publish it and realized he basically came to the conclusion like, oh crap, I actually don't think Nim had picked up language. I think he was just kind of doing tricks to please the researchers. But there's a lot of argument back and forth about why his eventual argument against ape language research was probably biased as well. If you're curious, though, this is, it was on Netflix last I checked. I have copies of it if anyone ever wants to borrow it in the future. So we'll stop there. That's the end of our language stuff, the end of topic 9. We'll go on to topic 10 soon for judgment and decision making. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask on the discussion board.